Welcome to episode 110 of our live streams. Jason, how are you doing today?
Always a good day to hang out with you, Dave.
Hey, likewise. And we are finishing up the sixth in our series of our cloud protection trends research, which we've been detailing a number of different components. But what are we going to double click on today, Jason?
Sure. So just in case you're tuning in, the Cloud Protection Trends Report, we covered 1,700 unbiased organizations, and they covered both production and protection clouds. So we looked at IaaS and PaaS and SaaS and BaaS and DRaaS and MSP considerations. So this week we thought we kind of blend it up a little bit because we're looking at the protection of those IaaS, SaaS, and PaaS, and specifically looking at long-term retention strategies for cloud-hosted workloads. If you haven't downloaded the report, take a look at the URL in the lower right-hand corner, or hit that QR code, and it'll take you right there. But today we're going to talk about how do you retain long-term data when the production data is itself natively resilient or durable.
And should give a shout out wherever you're tuning in from around the globe. Feel free to put in the comments section where you may be joining us from. I'm in Colorado, Jason's in Texas, our producer's in Georgia, and our production assistance is in Romania. So we've already got 3 U.S. states and 1 other country lit up, but love to hear where you're tuning in from. And of course, as always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those in as well. We do have a team that's monitoring that and relays back to us anything that may come up. So Jason, just double down again. Yep, this report, vee.am/CPT Cloud Protection Trends 23. I always encourage everyone to go download any research. Reason why is you owe it to yourself to get informed. It is not a Veeam commercial. These are not only Veeam customers, to your point, 1,700 unbiased, global, 28 countries. So let's jump into our first portion.
Yeah, so one of the common questions a lot of organizations have when they look at protecting cloudy data is, as I mentioned before, IaaS and particularly PaaS and even more so SaaS can be natively resilient, right? Chances are that hyperscale cloud that you're using, their metal's probably better than your metal. Right? So you're going to have better uptime in many cases from that, but does that absolve the need for backup? And one of the things that we see is that, the fact that you're holding your data in a service instead of a server shouldn't change that. And yet, this is actually some problematic data because it says a lot of folks are misunderstanding this. What you're looking at here is the question was, how long is backup data from cloud-hosted sources retained? And Dave, I'm going to just point out, only half of the workloads that were cited here hold their data for even 1 year. Now, if that data had been on-prem, you'd be holding it a lot longer.
Yeah, the concerning thing is that people are self-reporting, right? These
Right.
are results that individuals are responding with, IT professionals, admins, and the fact that they're stating, here's what we're doing, and yet we know, to your point, that the business probably has very, very different expectations. So right off the bat, there is kind of a mismatch of expectation.
And especially when you think about, the ugly elephant in every room in IT these days is ransomware. And with the long retention rate or the long pervasiveness rates that ransomware has, you can't rely on your backup of 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when you're talking about cyber events. If you're not holding your data longer than that, you are setting yourself and your organization up for failure. So this part's a little alarming. And again, 1,700 unbiased organizations. A few bad responses doesn't change these numbers that we're not holding data long enough. That said, let's look at when they're holding their data for at least a year. Where does that data go? And Dave, I think it's interesting here. The top 3 responses, you could choose all that apply. The top 3 responses are all cloudy repositories. Now, myself, I'm a big fan of any cloud backing up another cloud. And so the idea of putting that from, my productions in Azure, I want to put this in AWS or Google or vice versa. I like that option. I love the option of BaaS and DRaaS for IaaS and PaaS, right? Because why do I necessarily need to bring that data home? I just need to get it out of the initial operating environment. So I think that's really interesting. The third option, okay, I want to put it in the same cloud. I get it from a billing and operations perspective, but could we just put an asterisk on if you're going to do that, you better be using two sets of login credentials because otherwise it's like saying the only thing you're protecting on your NAS is with snapshots, and that's just setting you up for failure again. But Dave, take a look at the bottom. Disk, tape. We got options.
Yeah, I love it. You nailed it. You got options because if you just look at the number of bars checked, to your point, Jason, choose all that apply, we're over 200%. So that means on average, 1,700 organizations are doing two, maybe even more, some of them things,
Sure.
different repositories. I think that's an appropriate answer for most of us. But to your point, years ago, tape sometimes was viewed as it's going to fall off by the wayside because cloud will be the tape replacement slash tape killer. We're clearly not seeing that, although cloud is definitely embraced.
Sure.
I always say if you've got that technology deployed, you owe it to yourself to take advantage of that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look, should all of your data go to tape? Probably not, right? But if you have data that's going to be 10 years, 20 years, life of patients in healthcare, life of patents, right? Those kinds of scenarios, it is hard to beat the TCO of tape. I will say one of the scenarios in this mix that I think blurs the lines, but probably if I was going to say something that I think of as a hero scenario in 2023, what organizations ought to be looking for is BaaS and DRaaS providers that offer TaaS, tape as a service, as an option, right? Because what most people complain about with tape is they don't want to manage the cartridges. Well, if you got somebody else managing the rest of your backup jobs, let them manage the cartridge, right? It's still outside of your environment. I think you get to check like three boxes at one stroke if you do TaaS of BaaS and in BaaS and DRaaS for IaaS and SaaS and PaaS. That's pretty azzy, right? So
Very azzy, very azzy. And I think we may be getting an update on the map. I see a ton of countries. Oh, we just also got another that came in. So let's go ahead and just take a look at before we transition into our next slide. Of course,
hello.
loves of some of these larger geographies, Jason, Canada, as we can clearly see. In the United States, New York and Massachusetts have also come in. We've also got around in rest of world. We see Sweden, Germany, Albania, Armenia, Denmark, the United Kingdom, and Italy. And also Brazil, of course, one of your favorite places.
Yep.
Argentina is also great, both wonderful places. Love the food there, Jason and myself. Someday we're going to do a live remote in one of those countries or both, Jason, I tell you.
Yes, please.
And then we've got Colombia, Nigeria, as well as Dominican Republic, and we also have India as well. So shout out to all that. Thank you so much for coming in, chiming in. Keep that coming. We'll go back to that later in the broadcast. But so, Jason, if we're establishing we've got a problem on average for IaaS and PaaS, meaning we're not holding this data as long as the business most likely expects, the good news is when we're holding it, we're probably holding it in multiple different repositories. Let's double click now on some other applications.
Yeah, so remember with IaaS and PaaS in particular, those are things that are typically the workload is still self-managed. Usually the management structure and the admin responsible changes when you look at SaaS type applications like Microsoft 365. So, but remember, M365, I mean, this is the exchange that we always lived on, email, right? This is file services. This is foundational workloads like SharePoint, right? And so the question became, hey, what mandates does your organization have for long-term retention as it relates to email and unstructured file and those kinds of things? And this is a widespread set of data. I think it's interesting that 46% of folks said they don't have a mandate. And then if you did, you get one of the other options, and that includes industry regs. That includes my cyber insurance requires it. That includes geo requirements like GDPR along the way. So for about 54% of organizations, there is a mandate. And so then we said, okay, so, well, if there's a mandate, then surely you're holding that data longer, right? It actually doesn't turn out to be true. But that in mind, slide went a little heavy. Where are people storing M365 data? Remember, this is within the Microsoft cloud. So is everybody throwing it to Azure? Actually, a good chunk of people are, but you still see a good healthy mix. Take a look on that right-hand side, Dave. Azure is top of mind. Love that. PaaS right behind it. And then we still see disk and we still see tape along the way.
Yeah, and I think this is the right answer for this application, meaning Microsoft 365. Like you say, it's essentially a two-way tie, store the data in Azure, as well as maybe a third-party provider for backup as a service. But M365 is arguably the best SaaS application where you can pull a copy of the data and then do something with that because
Yep.
you've got access to Outlook, to OneDrive, to SharePoint. So instead of just sort of forensically fishing through something, you can actually be up and useful. So I think that's why we're seeing the bring it back to data center pretty high, as well as, hey, store it on tape, get it air gap, take advantage of long-term technology. If the worst comes to worst, and we're not going to name names and pick on anyone, but there is an ongoing incident around M365 from a service provider. It's been going on for quite some time now. That really speaks volumes to why you may want to have your own copy of this data.
Yeah. Now, I will give some props out here for the M365 folks out there. So notice that we said that almost half organizations don't have a mandate for long-term retention, and yet, follow the bouncing ball, only 6% of organizations said they don't hold their data for more than a year. So this is actually a case of well-curated, well-custodian data where even though there's not an outside mandate, people understand that for M365, yes, you have to have previous versions. Now, we can talk about the fact that even in the premier SKUs of 365, you can get things like legal hold, but that's not the same as backup. That's not the same thing as long-term retention. We could talk about the fact that the recycle bin absolutely is not how you do long-term retention. So I like the fact that 365 admins get it. Dave, I almost want to suggest that perhaps there's a maturity curve because people have been leaning into 365 as a mainstream production application for several years. IaaS and even less so PaaS has been as mainstreamy for along that same lines. What are your thoughts? Why is it that IaaS and PaaS aren't holding it as long? 365 folks seem to get it.
Yeah, I think a couple of reasons. One is, many of us have had an on-premises version of these same applications that comprise M365. So we're used to having a different expectation in terms of recoverability, granularity, the timeframes involved with that. I feel like we're going to go through some learning curves. As we've seen around disaster recovery, as an industry, we tend to learn the hard way, often repeating that lesson learned, meaning after a natural disaster, we learn that getting your data out of the building is an important thing. Same now, M365, ransomware, of course, is on the rise. It's forcing us to relearn some of those lessons as well. My expectation would be hopefully next year we start to see a bump up from an IaaS and a PaaS perspective where there's greater recognition. It's only going to take a few people a few times to lose data before the business is going to say this can't happen again.
Yeah, we just need a few more ransomware events and then people start holding their data longer. That's maybe not the answer we should be talking about. All right. So with because we see this mix, right? For the last two slides, we've talked about some folks are using cloud, other folks are using disk and tape. And I don't honestly think there's a wrong answer. I like the idea that long-term retention should, obviously it's longer, so TCO really starts to come into play. But I think you can accomplish that when you have cloudy production data, either within another cloud or bring it back on-prem. And so for the 365 environment, because they seem to actually know they're supposed to hold their data, the survey did ask that additional question of, hey, you're using a cloud as your long-term retention tier for 365. Why? That's on the left. Or you're using on-prem. You're bringing that data from a cloud back into your own environment. And to your point, for some folks, it's because the data is immediately leverageable. So we did ask in both cases. Let's take a look at the answers. If you look on the left-hand side, why do people use one cloud to protect another? The presumption, the top one is, faster recovery. But I like the fact that easier to manageability and security and economics. It's kind of a three-way tie for second place. Did that surprise you?
It absolutely does because, I actually would have thought we would have seen the results skew a little bit. But here what we're seeing is that the M365 protection crowd is pretty sophisticated, right? They are looking for things that make sense for them, for their business. So we've got a variety of different options, no clear-cut winner, and a variety that in some cases people might be embracing more than one of those options. Again, I would just go back to say that's probably the right answer.
Yeah, I will say the one thing that I probably assumed, and we all know what happens when you assume, the one thing that I assumed actually doesn't bear as much weight as I thought it would, and that is the bottom option. I would have thought, hey, I'm using M365, I'm using Azure in production, I've probably got these extra credits. Let me just consume Azure Blob Storage as the cheap option. And I've talked to enough CFOs out there to say, well, you're already using the cloud. Let's just use what we got. It's free. Or free because we have credits that we already paid for, right? Not really free. And actually, that was the bottom option, right? So I actually was, and I'm going to flip that and say what I think I'm hearing between the lack of concern on egress, which is second to the bottom, and then lack of ACR being the primary driver for it, is they're looking for the outcome and they're not being driven by cheapest option wins. And that, again, that's the right answer when you're looking at data protection. Dave, take a look at the right-hand side. What did you see there?
Yeah, that's interesting. When we look at if you're bringing it back on-prem, we still see a whole variety of different activities going on, which goes back to choice, goes back to flexibility. I love the idea of air-gapped immutable copies.
Yep.
And there's a number of different ways to achieve that. But what's interesting is you still see regulatory pop up pretty high here. So I think, and this is a case of where these administrators are understanding what their business expectations are a little more so than what we saw in IaaS and PaaS.
I like the fact that you see the operational considerations bubbling up on both sides, right? So that idea of easier to manage, monitor, capacity plan is number 2 on the cloud side. It's number 1 on the on-prem side. Right below that on both of them, almost a statistical tie, is more secure in the cloud on the left, and then more immutable air gappable on the right. So I like the fact that from an operational concern, you see both of those coming in top of mind. Doesn't surprise me that someone would presume that one cloud is faster to recover than another. I'm going to tell you, if you're using BAS and DRAS, that speed comes from the expertise of knowing how to recover faster, as much as the fact that you're not choking the pipe trying to get that data back up into the cloud of your choice.
I see
So,
we've got a question, Jason. Amit
yeah.
from on the LinkedIn channel says, we're looking for a backup solution for EC2 instances and RDS. Wanted to know, can we back up Redshift using Veeam? Yeah, actually going back to December rather of 2019, our solution has had EC2 support. So we've had that natively now for a little over 2 years. Also protect Redshift. So I want to give a shout out to that. Our Veeam backup and replication for AWS be the solution to check out there. You can check out veeam.com and drop right into that. So thanks for that question. I know also I'm being told we've got an update to the map, Jason.
Before you go to the map, though, the one thing that when you look at the Veeam backup for public cloud scenarios, what you want to look at, because I love the fact they're leaning into both EC2 as a production instance as well as RDS. We started with that most foundational workloads, which was server instances, right? And we do it not quite the same secret sauce that we use for Hyper-V and VMware on-prem, but looking at what we're doing with RDS. By the way, you can make that same claim for things like Azure SQL. Right. So databases are that next thing, and just continue to watch that as we continue to evolve for those more mature workloads. But I love that you're leaning that way. Right. If you haven't heard me say it enough, when you modernize your production, you got to modernize your protection while you're there. And Amit, that's the right way to think about it. So kudos on the query. Yeah, let's take a look at the map.
All right. So in the U.S., Washington has come in, the state of Washington, that is.
All right.
Also see over in Europe, we've got Hungary, and looks like we'll just pause so we can get over there. There we go. We got Hungary added, Switzerland added, and Czech Republic.
Right down the middle. That's nice. Just
very much so. It's very, very interesting. And we've got Congo and Kenya that also have come in. So shout out to that. For those folks. Thank you very much.
I don't remember the last time we had Kenya in the call. That is actually on my bucket list of places I really want to go. I have not safaried in that part of the continent yet. So
And Congo is something that's infrequent or maybe possibly even brand new for us too. So shout out to all that newcomers in
Nice.
2023.
Well, thank you for joining. All right, so we've got one more kind of key question we want to lean into. So we talked a lot about disk versus tape versus cloud. And even as I say the question, I've used the wrong word, Dave, because it's not versus, right?
Yeah.
It's not or. We should always be thinking and. Now, we've been talking from the cloud protection trends research, but we did do another research project in around ransomware, and this was actually so a little bit different survey instrument. Again, unbiased, not Veeam customers, but
Right.
1,000 organizations that actually suffered one or more successful ransomware attacks in calendar 2021, the data published in May of 2022. And so what we asked in this question was, in addition, remember, this is an and, not an or, in addition to whatever disk-based backup that you're running, what percentage of your production data is also backed up to tape and or cloud? You can see the options there. No real surprise that there's more data going to clouds these days than tape. And candidly, Dave, 45% of data still going to tape. I'm going to tell you, even and I love tape, might still be a little high for me. I'm still thinking maybe more in the 25-30% range of what percentage of your data probably has real long-term retention requirements. But I love the fact there's a pretty even balance, and almost nobody said zero on either side of the metrics.
Yeah, yeah, and I probably skew a little more pro tape, especially with the notion of if you've already made an investment in that
Fair?
infrastructure,
Yep.
go ahead, fully take advantage of that. So that's the part where maybe it doesn't surprise me too much, but it is a healthy mix at 45 to 62 there. So I think that would be surprising for many, especially, given what we're talking about here. However, it does go back to right tool, right task, use what's available to you, or to your point earlier, if you're using a service provider, ask them about tape out as a service for an additional layer of support. And you don't have to burden yourself with the responsibility of doing any of that activity. So it's an interesting mix. I think we could probably see this shift a little bit, but it's probably going to read a little higher than many would have anticipated in terms of tape usage.
Yeah. Dave, this was kind of a short lesson. I guess, the hopefully some of the data that we've shared for today is, get your data out of the original production environment, get it somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Anywhere else other than that. Store it longer than you think, right? The fact that you're using a service instead of a server does not absolve you of long-term retention mandates or the imperatives of it. Whether that's regulatory or ransom, but we've got a little bit more that we want to tease on today, don't we?
Yeah, we sure do. We are actually going to pre-record next week's episode. Reason why is Veeam is having its global sales kickoff. We're going to actually be geo-dispersed.
Yep.
Jason's going to be in Atlanta. I'm going to be in Kuala Lumpur. We're going to be doing live events in Bucharest, in Prague, and in Yerevan. But exactly 1 week from today, our Data Protection Trends 2023 report comes out on January the 17th.
Yep.
That's going to be the largest of its kind for the third year in a row. We keep breaking records. Now 4,200 unbiased organizations, not just Veeam customers. In fact, roughly 10, 11% might be Veeam customers because it generally follows the market share average.
Sure.
However, we've got a whole lot of information we're going to begin to unpack, because Jason, we'll do a whole series of unwinds on this.
Yeah, I think we were like scheduled for like 8 or 9 consecutive or nearly consecutive weeks in order to make that work. Look, let's talk about that 4,200 number for a second. We don't just keep asking more organizations why data protection trends, that macro report. We don't just keep raising the number every year for bragging rights. We do it because all of our research is really designed to help the industry and Veeam understand where things are going. What should we be building next, right? What is it that matters most to customers? And for those kinds of reasons, you don't need 4,200 responses to know what the industry is doing. Most analyst firms, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, they're in the 300, 400 range,
Yeah.
right? The reason we do 4,200 is not because you need that number for global representation, but you need it for global segmentation. So not only do we release the report that has over 4,000 responses in it, there's 250 in UK, there's 300 for Australia, there's 400 and some in the US. We cut it by 28 or 24 country level reports. We cut it for healthcare versus finance versus public sector. We cut it for SMB versus mid-sized commercial organizations versus large enterprise. You take that 4,200 number so that you can cut it to understand what every different part of the industry needs in order to be successful for data protection. Hugely, hugely exciting to be debuting that data next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And, shout out to some of the other research here. Jason mentioned the ransomware report.
Yep.
That's in the upper left-hand side, 1,000 organizations that did get compromised with ransomware. We've just concluded our cloud protection trends over in the lower left. We did a specific bit of research around Salesforce protection as way of our inaugural launch of a Salesforce backup solution. And then that URL will become active 1 week from today, as well as that QR code for data protection trends. And before we sign off, Jason, I do want to give a shout out to Poland and Tanzania. Tanzania might be a first added as far as I can recall. So shout out to those two geos for coming in.
Yeah, and in fact, as always, thank you for joining us. We are a global company, right? As Dave mentioned, we're going to be in 5 different areas in order to make sure that we're globally aligned and ready to serve your needs in 2023. So we're going to record next week in order to land that, and then the URLs are not live yet, so don't try to get it early. It's not turned on. But starting next week, we'll see the pre-recorded version of what Dave and I do for Data Protection Trends 2023. And that's going to start off a long multi-week series on what's changing for this year. Be sure to check out that episode as well.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you 1 week from today.